Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 2, beginning at verse 14. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, as Daniel was confronted with the possibility of being executed because he couldn't interpret the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, we are so thankful that he trusted in you, even in the worst circumstance. Help us, Lord, to have the kind of faith of Daniel that we might recognize that you are at work in difficult and horrible situations, and that you are in control of the world, and that it is for your glory that we are here at this time. Help us, Lord, to, like Daniel, to burst forth with praise instead of with anger or with pride when it comes to the problems of life. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we left off when Daniel was being told that the wise men of Babylon were going to be executed because they couldn't interpret the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just trying to get them to tell him what his dream meant. He wanted to guarantee that the interpretation was divine by not telling him what the dream was at all. So they had to tell him what the dream was and then interpret it. And so that was his way of trying to guarantee that whatever, because anybody could have just made up something if he told them what the dream was, to see if they were truly wise. Okay, and so Daniel was not high enough rank yet, because he was still in the 3-year study program of these wise men. And so when it came to the execution of the wise men because nobody could interpret the dream, it came as a surprise to him. And so that's where we left off, where it said in verse 13, "So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death." Okay, and then now we're in verse 14. Could somebody read that?
Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon.
Okay, so Arioch is kind of like a minister to the king. He's trying to carry out his master's issue to round up the wise men to have them executed because he's so angry, right? Because earlier, what was the problem that the wise men, when they were asked by the king to tell him what his dream was, what did they say?
They said that nobody could do that.
That's right. Okay, so first of all, they confronted the king directly. In essence, if you say nobody can do that, you're kind of telling the king that he's an idiot, right? And do kings like to be called idiots? No. So that was the first mistake, right? So and then this was the second thing that they did.
Interpretation.
No. Okay. First of all, they said nobody can do that,
Yeah.
and then when he told them that he was going to kill him, then what did they try to do?
Stall time.
That's right. They stalled for time. And in verse 9, the second part of verse 9, it says, the king says, "You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change." So by asking for time, he got even angrier. Okay, now we're going to compare this with what happens with Daniel in this section here. So, it tells us that Arioch came. Now, most of the names in the Bible have meanings. And so Arioch, we're not too sure what it means. There was a Mesopotamian king from centuries earlier who had that name, but it doesn't seem like that this is any. It doesn't have a specific connection with the Babylonian gods or anything. But Daniel's response to this command that he's going to be arrested and killed, he doesn't get angry. He doesn't try to argue. He's a young man, so he doesn't have a whole lot of, power or authority. But it does tell us, as it said earlier in chapter 1, that Daniel had a lot of wisdom, and so here it tells us how he responded, right? So it said that he responded with, discretion, and with sometimes it says tact, prudence or tact. So. Well, in the NIV it says wisdom and tact. So prudence and then discretion, depending on which translations you have. But so we see that those are obviously good traits. But there are traits that, in essence, they're kind of rare to find in people. I mean, because at his age, he must have been under the age of 18 at the time that he was taken into exile, right? So, and this is only a couple years into his program, so he could have been like 16, maybe 17, but at the time that this happened, which would have been really strange to see such a young man with these gifts. But that was part of the evidence that God had blessed him. Okay, verse 15.
He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree so urgent? Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel.
Okay, so so he doesn't understand what's going on because, again, I had mentioned that he's probably not, he doesn't have any connection yet with the court of Nebuchadnezzar, right? So there were wise men who worked in the court, and then there was these guys who were training to be wise men who weren't privy to that. So, whereas the people who worked in the court already knew that they were going to be executed, he had no information. Nothing was flowing down to where he was at. And, just asking why did the king issue such a decree? So he still doesn't know why he's going to be executed. They just come to carry out the order. In verse 16.
At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him.
So here, I don't know if you realize this, but there's a huge gap of time that you see between verse 15 and verse 16. Because first he asked the question of Arioch. Arioch had gone to his house. Now remember, like in the book of Esther, you can't come before a king without being called by the king. If you try to go before a king, he could have you executed. And you don't really get a chance to tell the king, I want to see you. It doesn't work that way. But Arioch is the guy who was going to be the executioner, or at least bring these people in. And so he asked the question to him, but it doesn't record his dialogue with him. It doesn't record the fact that Arioch would have had to go to the king to ask permission for Daniel to come before him. Then he would have had to get the okay, and then bring him there. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that's missing in between here, which is not such a big deal, but there's a reason. Why do you think instead of, if this were a story, like a narrative, you're just trying to do history, you would probably spend more time talking a lot about, the interaction of the people, right? So-and-so said this, and I said this, and this is what our discussion was about. But why do you think he purposely skips over all that? What's the emphasis of this chapter? What are we moving toward? There's a section in here that's much longer than the rest of the sections that we're looking at. It's coming up in verse 20.
That's when God gives him the ability.
And then
Wisdom and power.
We want to hear Daniel's interpretation.
yeah, well, even before the interpretation of Daniel even shows up, that's at the end of the chapter. The middle of this chapter is actually, so in Hebrew poetry and Hebrew writing, there's this thing called a chiasm, where you have the first and the last sections are parallel, the second to last sections are parallel, and then the middle is the important part. So everything is focusing in towards the center of the book, and so the center of this book, of this chapter that is it's not just his interpretation, but what is it?
Praise to God.
It's his praise to God. So the interpretation is secondary to Daniel's praising the Lord. So this is actually a little psalm in the middle of this chapter, which is really interesting. So a lot of commentators have pointed out that he moves from the narrative quickly so we can get to the heart of the matter, and the heart of the matter is verses 20 through 23, which is the Psalm of Daniel, a psalm of praise. And so you don't even know what the interpretation is yet. You just get to hear his praise. Okay, in verse, let's see here. Okay, verse 18, or I think we're on 17 now.
17. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Ezra.
Azariah. So those are the three. Those are the Hebrew names of the three friends of Daniel, which are also renamed. Right? They were all given Babylonian names, so their names would have been Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but these are Hebrew names, and that's because Daniel's talking to them. In fact, the only time that their Babylonian names are mentioned is when they're before the king. So here Daniel's talking to them, so he uses their Hebrew names, and he is telling them this, not only that the command to be put to death has been issued, but then also about it's interesting. Verse 16 kind of skipped ahead and talked about how the Daniel went into the king.
Well, it says that Daniel set up an appointment with the king.
What does your translation say? Does it say that?
It says Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time, that he might show the interpretation to the king.
Okay. So the fact that he went in to talk to the king would have only happened if Arioch made it possible for him to do that. So the fact that they skipped over a bunch of stuff, and earlier it had mentioned that the other wise men had asked for time, and now Daniel's asking for time. So there's an interesting parallelism here. You see, the other ones make the king angry. Why doesn't Nebuchadnezzar get angry when he asks for time?
He was chosen by the king.
I don't think he
So
Okay.
he sort of has a little bit of a input.
So his being chosen was really, in the first chapter. It showed us that, like you were saying, that he had impressed Nebuchadnezzar, and he was already seen to be wiser than most. So the Lord had given Nebuchadnezzar and others a view of Daniel that he was blessed by at least the gods, but specifically by the God of the universe, and so that was definitely part of it. I think is also the things we mentioned earlier is that Daniel didn't insult the king by saying, nobody can do that. You're crazy to even think that. So he doesn't insult him. He doesn't challenge his authority, and he also, when he asks for more time, the way that he does it is not to manipulate the king. That's why earlier the king got angry and said, "You're trying to, speak evil to me," or something. It was an interesting way of describing it, that he thought that they were trying to manipulate him, whereas Daniel simply asks for time that he might interpret it. He's not saying I can't do it. He's simply saying, give me the time to do it. And the king knew that these people were kind of like the wise men of Babylon were kind of like astrologers. They had to consult the gods. So that's kind of what he's doing. Obviously, he's only asking the Lord, the only true God. Did you have a comment?
The RSV says a time. It sounds like what he just went in and it doesn't even really give the impression in this translation that he spoke face to face with the king, but that he went in and he made an appointment to set a time. He went in and set the time.
So there's different ways of interpreting that, but he wouldn't have been able to go into the king unless Arioch had got him in to go do that, because you can't see a king without the king asking for you. So that's another thing, that the Lord paved the way for him to even do that is a miracle.
He merely requested a time. He didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't even get the impression that he spoke face to face with the king at all, that he went into the king's presence, that he went to the king's.
Yeah, so a lot of the details are being compressed here, and the reason is because the narration is trying to get past the history part and get to the most important part. And then once you get to the, and for sometimes readers, like we're reading through this, you might get to the part about the praising and the psalm, and you might say, well, gosh, why is this in the story? It doesn't help me. And so we might just pass over it. So our tendency as a reader is to get to the heart of the matter. We want to find out what's going to happen, whereas Daniel, and as the writer of this, is not interested in just telling us what happened. He wants us to recognize that this is about God's intervention, and praising God is the only correct response.
my Bible says, as the king's advisor, Daniel had access to Nebuchadnezzar and asked for an appointment.
I would say that that's not true, because it said earlier in the chapter that he wasn't finished with his training, so he was a student, and he wasn't an advisor of the king yet.
Okay.
He was
This
just
is the ESV.
right. Yeah, so that's just a misunderstanding from from where he was at in the process, right? So later on he became a king's advisor, right? I mean, it's after this event, then he truly is. But so what they're doing is like they're looking at his standing with King Nebuchadnezzar through most of his life, but not realizing that this was one of the first things he ever did, the first time he stood before him, and he wasn't even a wise man yet, or at least he hadn't finished his training.
But he was about to be killed.
Yeah, well, because he was lumped in with.
Killed in any case.
Yeah, he was lumped in with all the other people who couldn't interpret the dream or tell what the dream was in the first place. Okay, verse 17, it says he returned to his house and explained, so he talked to his friends, verse 18.
He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon.
Okay, so after having told the king, or asking the king for time to interpret the dream, notice that his response to his friends is to urge them to plead for mercy. So they didn't assume that they were going to get an answer from God, right? I mean, imagine in our prayers sometimes we might think, God, it's your job to answer my prayers. It's not God's job to answer God answers our prayers yes or no, or maybe, and so sometimes we just don't like the answer that we're getting. But notice that he doesn't have any assumptions about what God should do. He doesn't have any beliefs about how he's deserving of this. So how do you characterize Daniel's attitude in this situation? I mean, because he's facing death right now.
He leaves it in God's hands.
Leaves it in God's hands. Yeah, and notice his humility. He doesn't believe that he is owed anything, right? He's not like a lot of Gen Z today who, they think that they deserve this, that, or the other thing. Hard work is what it takes in life. But even here, he recognizes that he could work as hard as he could, and God's answer still could be, no, I'm not going to give you the answer. And I think that because of what he's doing here is what we're going to see in the next chapter when the three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are thrown into a fiery furnace. They say, our God can save us, but if he chooses not to save us, then we're still not going to worship your idol. And so they are carrying out the same attitude as Daniel. So Daniel is kind of like the mentor, or at least he's the example for the group, and they're all carrying out the same understanding of how to approach God. So I think in our own prayer life we can learn a lot about how we should come before the Lord. So he asks God for mercy, and he's asking God to reveal the mystery. So the word here, mystery, is used more in the book of Daniel than any other book of the Old Testament, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of apocryphal and the idea of apocrypha, right? So the mysteries of the end times. So that word kind of is used specifically because that's the type of writing this is. It's an apocryphal writing, and it's talking about mysteries. So he's talking about the first mystery, which is the mystery to Nebuchadnezzar. And later on, we're going to see even more mysteries, or dreams that we're not going to always be able to interpret about the future of the world. Okay, and it says it was revealed to him. Let's see, verse 19. Someone read that one.
During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven.
So sometimes in the Old Testament you see the word dream, that obviously is something that happens when you're sleeping, and then a vision, which can mean something that you see while you're awake. Like Ezekiel saw the vision of the dry bones in the valley, and they came together. So obviously he wasn't sleeping. But Daniel doesn't use the words that way. I think it might be a result of the fact that this section is actually in Aramaic. So the word for vision and the word for dream are used interchangeably here. And sometimes they'll just qualify a vision like at night. Like you'll say, a vision came to me at night, which isn't just another way of saying a dream. So it doesn't necessarily mean, anything in particular. It's just kind of a parallel way of saying the same thing. And then his once the revelation comes to him, he praises the Lord. So it's introducing this key part of the book. Okay, verse 20.
Was this song that you referred to, is that
Before he talked to Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah, I realize that, but before he had, after the vision.
Right, after the vision.
Yeah, after the vision.
Yeah, so he woke up in the morning, and then he told his friends, God revealed it to me, and then he breaks out in praise. Okay, so in verse 20.
Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might.
So it sounds similar to some other places in the Bible, right? So, places in the Psalms, in the Proverbs. We can certainly find lots of parallels. For instance, Psalm 113, verse 2. Let's look at that. Because Daniel was written a lot later than the other books of the Old Testament, he would have known these books. So Psalm 113, it could have been on his mind when he wrote this.
What was that?
Psalm 113, verse 2.
Let the name of the Lord be praised both now and evermore.
Okay. Yeah, and so you can see that the Psalms in the end of the book of Psalms, there is a collection called the Psalms of Praise. And then there's some of them specifically that uses the word hallelujah, which means praise be to Yahweh. So that's, that's what the word actually means. Hallelujah means praise be to, the Yah part is short for Yahweh. Praise be to the Lord. So this section of praise psalms was probably used in the temple for centuries, and so Daniel would have known this pretty well. And just using a kind of an example of a praise psalm, let the name of the Lord be praised for both now and forevermore, is something similar to what he says here. And then another one that's similar to this would be Job chapter 1, verse 21. And Job is, probably the oldest book in the Bible. It predates most of the other books. Job 1, verse 21. Right. I think it's the end part of that, like you said.
I got Job 12:18
Yeah, that's.
for the following verse.
Okay. Well, Job 1:21, is kind of like it's written in Hebrew poetry. It's Job's response to when his wife told him, why doesn't he just curse the Lord and die? And then he says, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And so he's recognizing that God's answer to him was, he didn't require God to give him good things for him to worship God. So that was the whole point of the book of Job, is that the devil said, Job only worships you, God, because you bless him. And God says, nope, I know that's not true. And so he allows the devil to attack him. And then the devil, after taking all this stuff away, even his health, Job, shows the truth that God is worth worshiping even apart from physical blessings, right? And so he says, God can give to me and God can take things away from me, but I'm still going to bless his name because I'm not in this just to get stuff out of him. Because otherwise, God is like Santa Claus, that we're trying to be good so we can get stuff, as opposed to God being a merciful God and a loving God. And if we recognize his true nature, then you want to worship him and love him no matter what. Even if in his wisdom he decides, I'm going to take this stuff away from you because it's not as important for you to have it now than it is for you to grow in your faith And so that Daniel is well aware of that fact, that God is, his ways of doing things are mysterious. And who are we to question God? You know, a lot of people in our world today think that the way that God answers things is proof that God is evil, or that he doesn't exist, or that he's not nice, right? For instance, you've talked to a lot of atheists, they'll say, you know, well, if God really does exist, what kind of a God would allow innocent children to suffer and die in our world, right? So wars and child abuse and killings, all these are evidence that God doesn't exist in their mind, because unlike Job, they don't have faith. So they expect God to act a certain way, but they're not willing to understand the fact that if God treated us fairly, then we'd all be destroyed because we're sinners.
Well, that kind of relates to what I'm thinking. It seems odd to me, I think I got this right. Daniel commits, and then he goes and asks the Lord for mercy to make it, to help him out, so to speak. Well, that sounds a little bit like what you were saying there, is that he had a vision that God was going to take care of him or something to that effect? I don't know.
Well, he didn't have the vision until after he told the king. He actually just asked for time so that he might interpret the dream. And what he was really asking for is the time to actually pray to the Lord, right? So he wasn't going to like demand that God give it to him, but he was going to pray to the Lord. And if God's answer was, my will is to not reveal this to you, and then of course you're going to be executed, because in doing so, maybe you become a martyr, and the rest of the Jewish population will rise up and become either more faithful or be willing to listen to me more. But God's answer, of course, was, I'm going to tell you what the dream is, and in a vision at night, he received that. And so he wakes up in the morning and he praises God for that. So the beginning of his praise, it sounds like the Psalms. It sounds similar to the way that Job responds at the end of that verse from Job 1, verse 21. And verse 21 of this, back in Daniel chapter 2, what does that say?
So isn't it like saying that he would say, just a minute here, let me pray about this?
Yeah, there we go. That's what he's doing. But he can't tell the king, let me pray about this, because in the king's mind, that's not the way that astrology or astronomy works. You know, the Babylonian wise men were supposed to manipulate the gods by incantations, by calling upon them and giving sacrifices, because they had a transactional religion. So the idea is that you get the gods to do what you want by doing stuff for the gods. If you offer a sacrifice, like the right sacrifice, then the gods are going to give you something that you want. So he thinks that Daniel's like that, because all the other Babylonian wise men are like that. But he knows that the only way to get something from the Lord is just to ask for it. And God is a merciful God, and if he chooses to give it to you, then that's fine. And, and the way that he approaches this, like it said in verse 18, that they pleaded for mercy from God. He knows they're going to be killed, so, he doesn't want to die, of course. So he's asking for God's mercy, because it's not the king that he's afraid of. It's the Lord who is in control. God can do all things. So he has to ask for mercy from God, not ask for mercy from the king. And so God can, give him the answer if he wants, but he's not making any assumptions. And the fact that God does answer him, then this section then is one of the longer sections in this chapter, for the reason of showing us that worshiping God is a higher priority than the things of this world, right? Because he skipped over a lot of the stuff that was happening. Okay, so in verse 21.
He changes, go ahead.
Go.
He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding.
So this is similar to in the book of Proverbs, right? The book of Proverbs, where wisdom is calling out and calling people to listen to her, because it personifies wisdom as a noble woman. And like in Proverbs chapters 2 through 8, it talks like that. So here it's there's another book that is similar to this, because this is in the wisdom tradition as well. The book of Ecclesiastes, right? You know that song that got turned into a song on the radio by the Byrds? Yeah, it talks about the seasons, and there's a time for sowing, a time for reaping, a time for peace, a time for war, right? And most people would say, how is there ever a time for war? And people protested and they get all mad. But we have to recognize that people are sinners. Sin's not going to end in this world until Jesus returns. And God's going to use all these things for his glory. It doesn't matter if things don't turn out politically the way we want. God's still in control. And that's one of the sad things, like when the person that you vote for doesn't get elected, what do? Right? And so remember when there was a lot of people who got so upset in the 2016 election because their person didn't get elected that they just got really angry. I remember hearing in colleges students needed to have safe places that they could go to because they were so upset. People were skipping school because they were so upset for not getting the person they voted for into office. But for a believer, it doesn't really make any difference who gets elected for positions, because sometimes God allows people who may or may not be so nice to be in office in order to bring about an awareness of how bad things are in the world, right? So do you think that the Jewish people, when they were in Babylon, they didn't want to be there, but do you think they learned anything while they were in Babylon? Yeah, and Daniel's actually proof of that, because a generation before him, people were worshiping idols in Jerusalem. Now he's in exile, and he's not allowing the idols to even get close to him. He doesn't want to touch their food, doesn't want to drink their wine. He's going to eat the vegetables and drink the water that's pure and kosher, and he's going to lay his life on the line for the Lord, because he's not going to worship any other god. And God is blessing him because of this. And so the book of Daniel is written as an encouragement to those who are in the exile. And we're not in exile, but in a way, Babylon is a typology for what? Babylon is not the homeland of the Jewish people, the believers in the true God. They're in a foreign land. Their citizenship is somewhere else. So Babylon is a picture of what? Of the world. Right. We're in Babylon right now. And the New Jerusalem is heaven, and that's where we're heading. We need to get back there. And in the meantime, we need to trust in the Lord.
That's getting worse in Babylon here.
Yeah. Right. It was funny, there was a movie came out a few years ago called Babylon. I was thinking, that's not a good thing to be, especially from a religious perspective. We're basically advertising something that's supposed to be evil and worldly, but the world rejoices in sin.
Worldly.
Yeah, the world, they rejoice in their sin, right? They don't care.
There's a newspaper, isn't it? Babylon Bee.
Right, and that's a satire. Okay, so let's see. He continues on with his description of how God's in control, the kings of the world. Well, and actually, verse 21 is kind of giving us a clue to what's going to happen in the interpretation, because it's about the different kings of the world.
Yeah.
Okay, verse 22.
He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him.
In Hebrew poetry, there's different ways of writing, and the main thing is that they use something called parallelism. That means like the lines are supposed to play off of each other. So chapter 2, verse 21, it talks about God gives, like it said, he gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. That's parallelism that's called synonymous, because those two lines are basically saying the same thing in different ways. But verse 22 is called antithetical, because now you're contrasting two things. So he talks about how God knows what lays in the darkness, but then the light dwells with him. So they're contrasting light and darkness. So these are just common ways that Hebrew poetry works. And part of the reason why I think that the parallelism is important is because, just imagine a language that was used thousands and thousands of years ago, right? I mean, the Hebrew people were speaking this language back in, to the 20th century BC. That's over 4,000 years ago. So a language that how many languages do you know today that are still in existence 4,000 years? Only Hebrew, right? That's the only language that has lasted that long. I don't know, maybe somebody can argue that Chinese has been around that long too. I'm not sure.
What about Greek? Isn't that-
Yeah, Greek isn't nearly as old. The Greek language, dates back to the like the 5th century BC at the earliest, and we're talking about 2000 BC, right? So, so in the Hebrew language, a lot of the words could have been lost to time, but because of using parallelism, where you have two lines that are either contrasting or trying to say the same thing, you have a better way of understanding what the meanings of the words are because of the synonymous nature or the antithetical nature of the parallelism. I think that God in His wisdom chose the Hebrew language, and then the way that they wrote a lot of their psalms made it possible for us to understand the language throughout the centuries. And because there were no Hebrew dictionaries that fell out of the sky, right? I mean, how do we know what the words mean at all? Once you get, like Navajo is a language, right? But how many people speak Navajo? Once it doesn't reach enough generations for there to be enough people to even speak the language, it just disappears in time. And Hebrew could have been lost in time as well. But because of the way that it's written, it made it easier for people to find the words and pass that information down through the centuries. Okay, so verse 23.
To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter.
Yeah, so this is like one of the longer verses in this little psalm. And he started out by praising the name of the Lord, and then he ends by thanking and praising God. So that you can see the chiasm. The first section and the last section are the same. And then, and so he's thanking God for specific things, that He gave him the wisdom and the power, and He made known what we asked of Him, or what we asked of you, and finally that you made known to us the dream of the king. Now, it wasn't that God gave the vision to all four of these young men, but He does give the, He doesn't take the credit for Himself. He's not trying to puff Himself up. In fact, we're going to see a contrast to, you've got Daniel getting the answer to the dream, and he doesn't make a lot of arrogant claims about it. But then Arioch, the guy who brings Daniel before the king, is going to make a statement as if, oh, look, king, I'm the only one in the kingdom who actually could find somebody who can interpret your dream. So he's trying to, and first of all, he didn't find him. He just showed up at his house to kill him. And Daniel is the one who said, oh, nobody even asked us, and I'm gonna give you the answer. So Daniel is showing his humility and the way that he responds to the Lord, and so the key to any situation in life is prayer and praise. And so this middle section of this chapter is focusing on that important aspect. If we spent more time, one of the things that Luther said is that during the Reformation, he had so many people attacking him and so many difficulties in life. He says the more things I have to do, the more time I need to be in prayer. So he actually tried to spend even more time in prayer when the Reformation was at its worst, with attacks and stuff like that.
I think I heard that he spent 4 hours in prayer each day.
Yeah, 2 to 4 hours a day. I'm sure that he was a monk for a long time,
Yeah.
and so he had the practice of doing that type of prayer. They would wake up, there's the hours of prayer that the monastic people will follow. So they do prayer at when they wake up at 6 a.m. and then they do prayer in the mid-morning. They do prayer at noon. They do prayer in the late afternoon. They do prayer before dinner, and then they do prayer at night before they go to bed, and then they wake up in the middle of the night. So, I'm sure that 4 hours of prayer to him seemed like it wasn't anything compared to being a monk, because as a monk he had to wake up 10 times during the night and pray. Yeah, but compared to us today, though, people don't nearly spend as much time in prayer. You know, but I think it has to do with how you understand prayer. So if you think prayer is just talking to God, then maybe we don't do enough prayer. But I think that prayer is a dialogue. So asking God and then listening for God is also part of the prayer. So it's just an attitude of approaching life with the anticipation that God's going to answer you, and you're looking for the answer. Because God does speak to us. You know, he speaks to us in his word. So in essence, reading the Bible is an aspect of prayer. God can answer your prayer through other people, right? So when somebody gives you godly advice, God's speaking to you that way, through circumstances, through, miracles, through dreams. You know, those things are not as common, and they're certainly not, it shouldn't be expected, right? You know, God doesn't promise he's going to answer everybody's prayer with a dream, but he does promise that he has everything that we need to know has already been spoken to us in his word, right? So the word is already there. So nobody can say, well, God hasn't answered my prayer. Well, read the Bible, because the answer is in there, and the answer sometimes is wait, right? You know, God can answer no. He can say no, go, or grow. That's one way of doing it. Sometimes the growing part is more important than anything else. But so Daniel's answer was pretty quick, and so he's appropriately praising God for how awesome God is. Saying that he gave him wisdom, right? And wisdom, of course, is one of the key teachings in the Old Testament. That the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So Daniel is showing us the fear of the Lord, right? The fear of the Lord is not. It doesn't just mean to be afraid of God. It does mean to have honor and reverence, but especially I think it has to do with dependence on God. So you're looking to God for guidance in life, recognizing that he gave us his law as like a ruler to show us what his will is, and so you don't need to be afraid about breaking the law, because God in his mercy has already forgiven us. But it is in following the law that we can find joy, like in Psalm 119, where it says, I delight in the Lord's laws. Who can say that unless you recognize you're already saved, right? Because if like Paul says, the law tells me what not to do, and I says the things I don't want to do, I do, who's going to save me from this body of death? So if we approach the law the way that Paul does, we recognize that it leaves us knowing that we're going to be condemned, and we can't help ourselves because nobody can stop sinning. But the psalmists, like Psalm 119, really has a different perspective. It's called the third use of the law. It's the perspective from sanctification. It's the idea that you're saved already, and that the law can be used as a way of trying to follow God's will out of love. Because remember what Jesus said. How do we fulfill the law? There's just one word. Love. Love fulfills the law. And then he talks about the two great commandments. Love the Lord your God, and then love your neighbor as yourself. So those two commandments fulfill all the law. So Daniel, of course, is giving praise where praise is due. And then he moves on to verse 24, where the dream interpretation begins. Someone read that?
Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation.
Okay, so so Daniel, he's not really able to. That verse earlier in verse 16, where it said that he went into the king, that it may have been that he just got an appointment with the king, like we were just talking about, because it's not really possible for you to go in to see a king. So he goes to Arioch first to get the appointment, and then Arioch was called to be the executioner. And the word here in the Aramaic actually means one who slaughters, and it's usually used to describe. Oh, okay, yeah, it's used to describe like a butcher, right, with animals, and so the idea that the king is treating the wise men like animals to be killed because they're good for nothing, right? They're not able to do what he hired them for. They're supposed to be able to interpret dreams. They're supposed to be able to call on the gods, and the gods will reveal to them anything he wants. And then when it's not happening and going his way, he gets angry. So this Arioch guy is the person who's going to be the slaughterer, and he's asking them to not to carry out the job that he's appointed to do, but take him to the king. And so he makes this bold statement: I will interpret his dream for him. Okay, and then verse 25, what does he do?
Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I have found a man among exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means.
Yeah, so this is the point I was making earlier about how Arioch he's trying to claim something that he doesn't have any right to claim. He didn't find Daniel. He didn't look for him. But, isn't that the way it works? In our world today, people will try to take credit when they didn't have anything to do with it, right? They're trying to steal the glory. Daniel's not interested in the glory himself. That's why, he praises God, and he doesn't even try to tell the king that, he has the ability to do this, because he always gives the glory to God. So what we're seeing here is the contrast between Arioch, a selfish, secular, arrogant person, compared to this to Daniel, who is a servant of the Most High God. Okay, and let's see, the next verse is verse 25. Oh no, that we just saw that, read that. 26.
The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation?
Right, so he would have been introduced to the king as Belteshazzar, which is the name that was given to him back in chapter 1, because anything that involved the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar gave names to everybody that was based on the gods of the Babylonian pantheon, right? So I think that Belteshazzar means something like servant of, one of the gods of the Babylonians.
Strong's dictionary said it means Lord of the straitened treasure.
Yeah, so but it's obviously a Babylonian name,
Yeah.
and so Daniel would not have been introduced with his Hebrew name, because they always thought that the Hebrew people were no good, right? So the Persians and the Babylonians both looked down on the Hebrew people as being like a lower type of people, so a race that wasn't, and you can see that anti-Semitism is part of the culture of the world, even in the ancient times, and even today we still see it rearing its ugly head. But God says in the Bible that He chose the Jewish people not because they were, special, or not because they were strong, or not because they were, they had any kind of gifts or abilities, but because God wanted to use them to proclaim His glory. So it was in their weakness that God's glory was revealed. And their weakness, God's strength, is shown to the world. Because nobody can say, these Hebrew people were able to, trick their way out of this situation, or to escape out of Egypt from the Pharaoh. I mean, the Pharaoh was the strongest king in the ancient world. So how in the world do the Hebrew people escape from Egypt? And the Bible's answer is that, God did this, and the miracles show that God's in control. Now this is, that the Exodus happened in 1460 BC, and this is in 500, so 530. So we're talking about, like 900 years later. And, you have a new king, a new nation, and, kings don't learn anything. They just keep doing the same sinful things over and over again. And so Nebuchadnezzar is just like the Pharaoh, right? He didn't care about anybody but himself. He thought he was a god. And, but he does ask him, are you able to tell me? And just imagine the temptation. Daniel is thinking, he might have thought, at least, the temptation could be, if I tell the king, yes, I can tell you what you want to know, then he's taking the glory for himself, but it raises himself up in the face of the king. I mean, why wouldn't anybody want to do that, right? So there's a lot of difficulty in this, and as Christians, sometimes we need to recognize the same thing. One of the things at my previous church, you know, if I had a real one time, occasionally I have a sermon that people in the church, some, you know, I had some people who would actually, you know, stand up and say, "Amen, Pastor," and then one lady said, "Give God the glory," and I was, to me, that was a very nice comment because you don't want to draw attention to yourself. If you can preach a good sermon, praise be to God. You know, not because, I mean, some people might think they're great preachers. I never thought I was that great, but the whole point is, like Daniel, we should always give God the glory. If you're good at something, praise God for it. Let others know. If they say, "Man, you're so talented at that," it's all God. You just give God the glory, just like Daniel's about to do here. So, and these kinds of things happen in our lives. You know, somebody comes along and tries to pat you on the back, how great you are. And so it's important for us to follow Daniel's example. Okay, in verse 27.
Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about."
Okay, and
Keep on going?
yeah, keep going.
Pardon?
Yeah, you can keep going.
Okay. "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the vision that passed through your mind as you lay on your bed are these."
Okay, so before we get into the interpretation, which we'll probably do next week, you know, he states the truth about how nobody could do this. You know, all the other wise men were in the same boat as he was. And,
Give it a heart attack.
yeah, right. Because, you know, I think he's probably thinking, I just told the king I found somebody,
This guy could do it.
and then he's just saying nobody can do it. Right. But then verse 28 is the key, where he says, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." So, you know, the idea of the mystery is that, you know, here's this interpretation and the dream itself that nobody knows. But he's going to tell the king, but God, the God in heaven. So that phrase, God in heaven, is a phrase that's only used in the Hebrew Bible when it's when Hebrew believers are talking to Gentiles, right? Because the Gentiles don't necessarily know who Yahweh is, but if you say the God of heaven, then it's, you know, it's kind of a generic term that people who aren't believers in the God of the Bible or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would still recognize what they're talking about. So again, it's a generic term, and he's telling the king that this God is who's in charge. He's the one who gave me the interpretation, and I'm going to tell you. So this whole thing is being brought to a head is to be a witness. Nebuchadnezzar is going to get to see who the true God is, and it's not himself, because, you know, he thought he was divine. It's not the fake gods of the Babylonians, but it's going to be the God of Israel, and the whole book of Daniel is actually a witness to this nation, right? Well, to the Babylonian nation, it's a witness to the truth that there's only one God, monotheism, right? And then to the Persians, it's the same thing. And then, you know, even though the book of Daniel refers to the coming nations of the Greek and the Roman Empire, the same thing is true, that God's people will continually be a witness to the secular and pagan nations that there's only one God, and it's not, you know, the gods of the secular world.
Do you think any Babylonians turned to the Lord?
Well,
Or don't we know?
even Nebuchadnezzar, he didn't say that there was no other gods, but he came to a point later on in chapter 3 where he says, you know, oh, the God of Daniel is the true God. So, you know, that's as far as some of these Babylonians could have gone, right? You know, people raised in a culture where maybe their livelihood is dependent upon their believing in the gods. Think about the Roman Empire. The reasons why Christians were persecuted is because they were told all they were asked to do was to acknowledge that Caesar was Lord. You know, he was a god, and they didn't even care if you believed in Jesus, as long as you also worshipped some of the other gods. And, you know, your worship was perfunctory. All you had to do was offer a little bit of incense and a fire. That's it, right? You didn't have to do much. And so the idea that a Christian wouldn't do that, would rather die than offer a pinch of incense in front of a statue of the Caesar, was unfathomable to the Romans. They couldn't understand it. And, you know, they were considered traitors, because if you pray to the gods, then our nation will be okay. If you don't pray to the gods get angry, then they're going to wipe us out. So you're being a traitor by not worshiping the gods. The Christians would much rather die than to commit the sin of idolatry. And so Daniel is a good example of that as well, because for hundreds of years, the Jewish people had abandoned worshiping God, and they were worshiping idols. But now you got the exile, and you've got some of these people like Daniel and his friends that are worshiping God alone and are willing to die for it. So, I mean, that's the kind of witness that we should be able to have. God doesn't call everybody to be a martyr, and we don't live in a society that is martyring people. And maybe they're martyring reputations, right? Like if you believe in Jesus, you'll be, blacklisted or you'll be canceled. So be it. But in his day and age, you were being murdered if you didn't acquiesce to the culture and worship the gods of the rest of the nation. We just have to look at what Daniel's doing, because he's an example, right? This book was written at a time where the Jewish people were going to continually be under persecution, all the way through the Roman times, right? So the Babylonians persecuted them. The Persians were a little bit nicer, although it's interesting because they allowed the Jewish people to go home to their homeland. But remember the story of Esther. It just took one guy to say, I hate the Jews and I'm going to have them executed. So we got the king to sign a law. Oh, on this day we can kill any Jew we want. And Esther saved the day by revealing to her husband, the king, oh, I'm Jewish and my whole family is Jewish, and you really want to kill me and my family? And he was upset that he was tricked into signing a law to execute the Jewish people. But that's, what happens when people don't think about stuff.
But
Haman.
he got his just reward.
That's right. Yeah, because the king saw through it. But that was another aspect, is that in the law of the Persian Empire, a king could not rescind the law. And so, you shouldn't make laws unless you are absolutely sure. But he didn't really think about it. He allowed Haman to convince him to pass an evil law. So there's some places like that in Daniel, because Nebuchadnezzar has that dream. We're going to look at the dream next week. And then he ends up making his own statue after he had a dream about it. And he wants people to worship him, a statue of himself. And so he didn't seem to really learn from what Daniel's going to tell him. And so that'll be a point for next week, is you have the interpretation of the dream that Daniel gets, and he automatically praises God. Nebuchadnezzar is about to get the interpretation of the dream from Daniel, and what is his response going to be? It's not going to be praising God. It's going to be more selfishness. Praise himself. There we go. Yeah, and so that's how the chapter ends. Okay, well, we'll stop here, and next week we'll start on verse 29.